Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again for coming out on this very wet day. I also just have to shout out a couple of people. So first of all, Rachel's sister, Christina Swarns, is here with us, and she's and someone who I deeply admire, Nell Urban Painter. Howard Professor of History Emerita at Princeton, and is now an artist. And so, if you don't know her work, please look it up. And then my lovely wife, Stephanie, is here with us. So I've actually had the chance to interview Rachel many, many years ago when American Tapestry came out, and we were at the Schomburg Center, and that interview actually was captured in a Moyers episode. Did you ever see that?
Oh, no.
Yeah,
I didn't know that. Okay.
There was a camera in the audience, so it's part of posterity. But Rachel has now distinguished herself with two really remarkable works of history. And while it's not unusual for journalists to write about the past, I think what is remarkable in this book, 272, is how archivally rich this book is. This is a book that takes seriously the evidence trail in order to reconstruct the lives of people on both sides of this really national and international drama, which is to say the role of the Catholic Church itself, and here the antagonists, shall we say, are the officials who come to be associated with Georgetown University over really centuries, and as well the family members whose lives were indelibly shaped by the institution of slavery and the relationship of the Catholic Church here in America to them and their descendants. So I guess the first question, I know often that historians stumble upon projects serendipitously. There's often trails between one project to the next, something shows up. You actually tell us in the beginning sort of how you come to this project, but maybe for the audience, talk a little bit about how you conceived of and why you decided to write this book.
So, first of all, thank you guys for coming out on such a rainy day. It's so wonderful to see everyone here. And it did emerge serendipitously, as these things often do, but again, kind of with connections to other things. I had a colleague at the New York Times when I was a full-time correspondent there who got an email from a Georgetown alum who had a tip, wanted to offer the Times an exclusive about a slave sale in 1838 that had benefited Georgetown. And my colleague was intrigued but uncertain because you have to remember that newspapers then, and even now, still mostly deal with the here and now, and this was before the 1619 Project. Ta-Nehisi Coates had written his powerful case for reparations that appeared in the Atlantic, but again, you know, she wasn't even sure, like a 19th century slave sale, was that even a story? And, you know, it's my great fortune that she didn't delete the email. And she didn't because she remembered that there was someone on the staff who might know. And she remembered my first book, American Tapestry, which traced the story of the Mrs. Obama's ancestors from slavery to the White House of 5 generations. And so she forwarded it to me. And I knew immediately because that first book about Mrs. Obama's family allowed me to explore how slavery shaped American families. And I could see immediately, like, this would be kind of the next thing that I wanted to do, which was to explore how it shaped American institutions. And so, and also, I called the guy, like, immediately. I knew it was a story, but also priests enslaved people? Catholic priests bought and sold people? I happened to be Black and Catholic, and I had no idea. And I wanted to know, why didn't I know? And who were these priests, and who were these families?
I'm surprised a little bit by that last part. I mean, I suspected you might be Catholic.
You know, it was only recently that I started talking more about it.
And I'm actually not saying I'm surprised that you admitted that you're Catholic. I'm surprised by your surprise that the Catholic Church was involved in slavery.
I think, of course, once I kind of stepped back for a second, of course it makes total sense, right? But, I grew up in Staten Island, which is a book in and of itself. The Catholic Church I know or grew up with was a Northern church. It was an immigrant church. And so, it kind of makes sense that a lot of people actually have no idea, because even though historians obviously have written about Catholic slaveholding, enslaved people have been largely left out of the origin story that's traditionally told about the Catholic Church. That's just not the story that we hear about, Mass and Sunday school and in Catholic schools. And so I think that's why I just was like, and I guess I thought to myself, I'm a reasonably educated person. I had just spent all this time diving into the 19th century, like, how didn't I know? But it does make sense. It makes sense because, of course, slavery is foundational to everything.
It also makes sense with the structure of the book, because the book opens, aside from sort of telling the story of this email and the opportunity to write initially about the sale that takes place in Georgetown, which we'll get to. It also opens in the 17th century, and essentially you retrace the steps of the first colonizers who come to Maryland as Catholics in search of their own religious freedom as well as profit-seeking. And we essentially are told a kind of origin story that centers Catholics as opposed to Protestants in a period of troubles that they experienced, separate apart from their encounters with indigenous people. And I think as a reader, I was struck by the way in which you situate this origin story as a way to say that there's no separate departure for the Catholic Church in America. Its roots are foundational to the colony of Maryland, and it grows up just like the nation with everything else that happens at that time period. Were you, as a person in the archives, did you find yourself stubbornly having to keep going back to the beginning? I mean, did you think you were going to be the 19th century historian again, and now you're like, why am I writing about 1664?
Honestly, because I started out, my first article for the New York Times about this was about this 1838 slave sale that benefited Georgetown. Because I started out with that, and I should, if you don't mind, maybe tell people a little bit about that. It was, in 1838, the Jesuit priests who had established Georgetown had tough times and a vision of the future that they wanted to fund. They happened to be among the largest slaveholders in Maryland. And they sold off 272 men, women, and children to support Georgetown, to save it from a collapse, to support and reduce the debts of their own organization, and to help create a vision of the Catholic Church that was quite different from the origin story that we're going to talk about. So I had my head in 1838 for a long time, and actually, a colleague, a friend, a journalist who I know, when I was thinking about, oh gosh, I've got all of this stuff, how do I even think about writing, a draft? And he said, start at the beginning. And when he said start at the beginning, that kind of opened things up a lot. Because if I was starting at the beginning, I was starting in 1634. And then it wasn't just Georgetown, it was the Catholic Church itself. It was, the colonies and how the nation emerged, yeah.
So there are three threads that I want you to just touch on to get us from the 17th century to the 19th century. One is that you essentially say that the entire edifice of Catholic institutions in the United States essentially start with this story. And the physical infrastructure that exists today, whether it's in Baltimore, whether it's St. Louis University, or any number of Jesuit colleges or schools around the country, grow out of this early. That's one thread. The other thread is that you establish the genealogy of these specific individuals, their thoughts, their decision-making, that gets us decade after decade. And I don't want to give too much away because I want to talk a little bit about that. But this sale in 1838 is really the culmination of a series of decisions that have been playing out for over 100 years, or almost 150 years. And then the last, which might surprise people, but maybe shouldn't, is that you center the lives of the enslaved at the center of the story. You want to do everything possible to recover who they were, to give them interiority, meaning how you know what they're thinking, and even when you can't know what they're thinking, the best that you can speculate they likely felt, the emotions that they felt at the threat of sale or punishment. So I'll let you just pick, those are the three things. The institutional history of the church, Georgetown's early decision-making around the lives of the enslaved, and then the lives of the enslaved themselves.
I'll talk about the foundational stuff about the church and then talk about the family. Like I said, I started with Georgetown in 1838, but as I spent more time in the archives and as I started thinking about, really what do I have here and where do I start, I realized that even though we think about the Catholic Church, many of us, as a northern institution, slavery was foundational. So priests who sold people and relied on slave labor established the nation's first Catholic archdiocese, the nation's first Catholic cathedral, nation's first Catholic institution of higher learning, Georgetown. Priests who operated a plantation and sold people established the first Catholic seminary. So it is the very underpinnings of the Catholic Church were built by priests who relied on the slave trade. And as you mentioned, to me it was so important to center the lives of the people themselves. And part of that was, there are a couple of things I was thinking. One is that if you are writing and researching about slavery, you know that there are people out there who are going to say, stop, wait a minute, long time ago, nothing to do with me, not interested. And I obviously do spend a lot of time with history, but I'm a journalist, so I think a lot about audience. And I thought it was really important. How do I get people to engage with these ideas? How do I get people to hear what I'm trying to talk about? And I thought 272 people were sold, scores of families. I would write about one. And that would be an entry point for people to really kind of get their minds around the story, to draw people to the story. And it would also deal with the erasure of the enslaved people at the heart of the story of Catholicism, at first in the British colonies and then in the early United States. And so I focus on the Mahoney family, and their experience parallels the emergence of the Catholic Church in the British colonies and the early United States, and the Church's reliance on slavery. And I start with the matriarch, a woman by the name of Anne Joyce, who is a Black woman who arrives as an indentured servant. And many of us know indentured servants, the history we learned, mostly Europeans come with a contract, a term of years that they're going to work, and then they go on their way. And that was certainly her hope too. But she arrived at a time when Maryland, established in part as a refuge, right, for Catholics, who faced persecution in England. She arrived at a time when Maryland was transitioning from a colony that had a workforce based on indentured servants to an economy that relied on enslaved labor. Her contract is burned, she's forced into slavery, she loses everything. everything except her story. And she tells that story to anyone who will listen, the white people around her, her children and her grandchildren, the descendants tell that story, and it's a fairly simple story. Our liberty was stolen, and we should be free people. And her descendants resist. She has descendants who kill an overseer and are executed. She has descendants who take the Jesuits to court, sue the Jesuits, file lawsuits to try and win their freedom, but only a handful are successful that way. She has a descendant who, during the War of 1812, Harry Mahoney, saves the wealth of the church at the plantation where he is in, and as a reward for his courage and loyalty, garners a pledge from the Jesuits that neither he nor his family will be sold, but that promise is broken in 1838, so when his children are sold. So I follow that line, and because I'm a journalist too, it was really important for me to have a family that was connected to, folks who are living today. Because much of what I really care about is how we live with this history.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Harry Maloney because he's aside from the matriarch you described. Sorry, I realized this was on one side. Aside from the matriarch you described, Anna and her story, his role is quite unique in this way because there's a tension in the storytelling between why Harry Mahoney, the patriarch for much of the period before 1838, is essentially why he stays. And you speculate that he stays because he's had 8 children, and he can't see his way to freedom at the risk of losing any member of his family. And I just found that quite powerful in storytelling because when we think of history and arguments, the argument would go something like this. Most black people resisted. White people imagined they were faithful servants. They weren't. And so we're reconciling the reality of black resistance against the mythos of faithfulness. But you tell us essentially that black people are constantly making rational choices in light of the limited opportunities they have and the great risks they take when their choices turn out to be wrong. So even the story of Moses, who leaves and doesn't come back until much later, essentially leaves his family. It's the opposite choice that Harry makes.
That's right, and I think, it is really interesting the choices that people make, and there's resistance in the way that, resistance running away, resistance killing an overseer, resistance.
Or keeping some of the loot, right?
Right.
Harry returns this money to keep from the British soldiers,
That's right.
and then he hands the money back, and I'm thinking, Harry, why did you take it back?
And people are, always trying to figure out, how do you survive here, right? How can you press the boundaries? He becomes the foreman, for this plantation, the right-hand man, essentially, of the priests enslavers. He had family members who managed to get freedom through the lawsuits, who managed to buy their way out of freedom, who found other ways, but he had his family, and yeah.
So I just want to also lift up one point that she's made twice now, which I think is also contrary to how a lot of people, what they think they know about slavery. The 18th century, sort of the spirit of freedom, as you write, and as other historians have written, didn't pass by the consciousness of enslaved people, or even people who were unfree by virtue of being indentures. And so there are all these lawsuits, and because I'm essentially a post-bellum to present scholar, I'm always just struck by how remarkable it is that in these early years, black people could sue for their freedom and have standing in court and win some of these cases.
That's right, and it's really something to think about. I mean, but it makes sense because these ideals, these revolutionary ideals, that were being talked about, the war that was happening, Black people were listening and they cared, right? Because talk about liberty, right? And so the Jesuits, the Mahoney family, the Queens, a number of families in Maryland, I mean, there were many, many freedom suits. And for me, actually, the suits for this family were incredible because the records still exist. So you can actually, there are depositions. You can hear the voices of, the people heard Anne Joyce's descendants, the people who knew her, people who had heard from their elders about her. But yeah, it's a fascinating time.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned that because the way you use sources in the story, so the book is very meticulous in detailing the sources, but not in the prose, so you won't be encumbered by footnotes. But let's talk about sources in terms of Georgetown. So even though the arc of the story, at least the story that gets us to what happens in 1838, is really just, you could argue, a coda. And by that I mean, people are being sold all along the way. And the debate about them being sold, and the permission to sell them, and the back and forth between Rome and the officials and the priests and those who are running Georgetown. So the sale in some ways may come as a surprise in terms of the final decision and the scale of it. But talk a little bit about the back and forth about running these plantations. You have very meticulous records to tell precisely how much money is being made, what people think of it, the competing notions amongst officials as to whether a plantation is being well run or not being well run. Are the people running it profligate? Are they keeping their sacraments or are they not? I mean, it's very much a very detailed account of how the officials themselves are engaging with the plantation business.
That's right, and it is very much a business. And so you have priests who are, kind of middle managers who are, in charge of, running these plantations with all of these enslaved people, responsible for growing crops and money to, send back to Georgetown and the province. And there are all kinds of tensions among the personalities of the priests involved. And two priests that I often talk about to give you a sense of kind of the divergence in opinion. One is Thomas Milady, who was an early college president and very influential one at Georgetown and a senior Jesuit leader in the 1830s. He is American-born, part of this new generation of American-born Jesuits who are sent to Rome, destined for leadership. And he and several others in this group knew slavery up close because they grew up with it. They had parents who enslaved people, so this is what they saw. And and Milady is an interesting person because he looked around and said, this Catholic Church, rooted in this plantation economy, this rural church, this church is not the future. The future is up north, and he looks north and what he sees are waves of immigrants pouring into the cities, and Catholic immigrants, and he said, that's where we need to be. We need to establish schools, colleges, we need to, situate ourselves in that way. That's where the church's future is. And of course, he wasn't wrong, but he is willing, because of the financial challenges they have, he needs money, and he's willing to tear folks apart to do it, families apart to do it, and ultimately goes back and forth with Rome about that, pressing. As you said, there are, for a long time, many historians who wrote about this sale described it as the first time that the church, the Jesuits, sold people for profit, that they sold people who were unruly or disobedient before. But the truth is that they sold for profit all along the way. One of the, in terms of the records, one of the most striking records is Archbishop John Carroll, who in the early 1800s looks at the plantations and the debts and says, okay, what are we going to do? And he suggests in a letter the sale of a few, quote, unnecessary Negroes.
Superfluous. Right?
Yeah, it's just like,
those are the words
yeah,
you quote in
yeah,
the document.
yeah.
Superfluous.
Yeah, and so all along the way that's happening. On the other hand, you have a guy by the name of Joseph Carberry, who has a very, very different view of the enslaved on the plantation he's in charge of. And he sees capacity, he sees faithfulness. And so when he writes about an enslaved man who builds a windmill, he marvels at the craftsmanship. And when the Jesuits complain, which they often do, about these plantations that are, they aren't producing and can't these guys work harder, he says maybe we should pay them. And he devises an experiment on his plantation where he divides up acres and says, families, you have your acres, you grow, harvest as you see fit. We share the produce and the profits. And when an Irish senior Jesuit who had been to this plantation in the 1820s comes back in the 1830s, he marvels at the change. And Carberry, when he heard about plans for a mass sale, has everyone in his community, white and black, praying that it won't happen. And when that doesn't work, he goes to Georgetown himself to protest. And when that doesn't work, he tells people to run when the slave traders come. And I think I like to talk about, the various perspectives, because I think one thing too I've discovered, if you were writing about slavery, is that people will sometimes say, don't bring your 21st century, morale, your ideas about, what's right and wrong to this history. Slavery was legal, keep that out. But the truth is that the priests were wrestling with these questions in real time. And Rome was too. The Jesuit superior in charge of the international organization, just delayed, and then there's a great quote where he says, I don't want to lose, we shouldn't lose our souls here. I'm worried about that. This is in the sale of these people. I mean, these questions were looming large, but folks like Carberry were fairly, they were lonely voices, surely.
One more question on this, and then we'll talk about what happens after the sale and where we are today on this institution. It's a kind of an odd thing to be rooting for the enslaved to stay on the plantation owned by the Jesuits versus them being sold. And I guess I understand, having read the book, but the audience may not understand.
Right.
So why would the sale itself be so terrible in the eyes of those who thought they were looking out for the best interests of the enslaved?
Right. So I guess it's interesting to understand kind of how the Jesuits reconciled any of this, right? How did Catholic priests reconcile this? Unlike some white people, they didn't see the enslaved people that they held captive as like animals or brutes. They saw them as human beings with souls, and souls that needed to be tended, and souls that they had an obligation to tend and to nurture. And so at the same time that they felt comfortable buying and selling their bodies, there was no prohibition from Rome there were condemnations from Rome about the sale of the indigenous, right? Enslavement of the indigenous in the Americas, but silence for a long, long time about black people. And so, they basically are, you've got this sale and these folks kind of wrestling with these ideas. And the question of Father Carberry thinks that, okay, I'm going to, well, let me back up and say that for a long time, Father Carberry was someone I was like, wow, Father Carberry, he's my guy. And then I realized that, Harry Mahoney had two daughters, Anna and Louisa. One daughter, Louisa, manages to run to the woods and escape slave traders who come. Anna, who has 2 young children, doesn't make it and is sent off to Louisiana. And so I'm thinking Father Carberry, and what happens to Louisa? She and her mother come out of the woods and they're welcomed back into slavery, where she remains until the Civil War. And I thought, how do you reconcile that? And so the answer is I don't exactly know, because he doesn't write about it. I think there were people who thought that selling people was wrong, but this kind of paternalistic idea of, we care for them, enslaving them was not. We care for them, we tend to them, we nurture them. I don't know whether he had the imagination to envision freedom and what that might mean, or whether he was just a middle manager who didn't have the power to. When the congressman who had purchased many of these people came back trying to Henry Johnson to gather up folks who had been left behind, Father Carberry bought Louisa back. He paid for her so that she wouldn't be sent. But it is that kind of...
I think so. Just one additional detail is that the threat of sale meant the threat of breaking up families, of which the church felt was a bridge too far in terms of its own moral compass in these days. And there was also the fear that the Protestants would be brutal. And so leaving the care of the Catholic community would lead to the degradation of these people. What's missing in all this, just so that we don't lose sight of this, is that there are no abolitionists in this story of the Jesuits. I mean, no one emerges making the anti-slavery argument that was very common, and certainly by 1838, was a social movement that would eventually help to bring forth the end of slavery. So I just think we just had to sort of put that in the air. So the sale happens, and what is the fallout for Georgetown? What comes of this for that institution to help us understand why this legacy today is so important?
So it is a scandal, actually, because as you point out, the idea was, and the priests felt, or said they felt, that it was important to keep families together. But in fact, families were torn apart in the sale. It became known that children were sent without parents, husbands and wives, people were torn apart, and priests talked about it. It became a thing. Thomas Milady, who had orchestrated it, is sent off to Europe, where he stays for a while. But the money comes in. Georgetown is, the debts are paid, it survives, it is now the institution that we know. For a time, there was some thinking that they only got the down payment for this sale and nothing more, because these buyers had problems. But enslaved people were considered property, and it turns out from the records that a lot of buyers, many small buyers, bought on the installment plan, and the money trickled in year after year up to the 1860s. And Milady's plan, he actually is kind of, he comes back, he's into the fold, back into Maryland, and becomes a leader of, establishes Holy Cross, which benefits from money from this province of Maryland, as does Loyola University, Maryland. The legacy goes on.
So we're going to open the floor to questions. I'm going to set up at least a question that I've been thinking about. So there are sort of two remaining threads, which is the descendants, and then the story of reckoning for the institution. So you could take either one. The degree to which we today know people whose connections, familial connections and lineage go back to these communities, and their understanding and relationship both to this history but also to your excavation, this book this is their story. And then, as the audience thinks of its own questions, I'll just put one out there for the audience, which is, how is Georgetown taking it all in? How are a broader community of either alumni and or Catholics who care about this issue responding to this book?
So, Georgetown and the Jesuits have both made efforts to try and address this history. Georgetown has done a number of things. Both institutions have apologized for their involvement in the enslavement and sale of these folks, and Georgetown has established preference in admissions for descendants, legacy status in effect. They've changed the names of some buildings. They've established a center for the study of slavery and its legacies. They have established a fund. They are raising $400,000 a year toward projects that are meant to benefit the descendant communities, which actually just got up and running this past year. There were some delays because of the pandemic. And then the Jesuits have partnered with a group of descendants to establish a foundation. They have pledged to raise $100 million toward racial reconciliation projects and projects that will also benefit descendants. It's the largest effort made by the Roman Catholic Church to address this history. But it has been slow going. The fundraising hasn't gone as well as they had hoped. Actually, Georgetown and the Jesuits just kicked in some more money into that pot. And as for the descendants, that has been one of the things that's been most interesting to me. When my first story ran, there were about a handful of descendants who had been identified with ties to this history, and there are now more than 6,000. And they are, people say, well, gosh, how do people feel about this? I say people wept, raged, and organized. They really have been pushing Georgetown, pushing the Catholic Church to address this history and to take concrete steps to do so. But they've also been doing something really amazing, which is getting back together. I mean, they are sitting around kitchen tables, they are having reunions in Louisiana and in Southern Maryland where the Jesuits' plantations were. One descendant who came to one of my book events said, we are now, a century later, bringing the families back together that were torn apart in 1838, and that has been something to see.
Hi, Rachel. We talked about this once before when I talked to you about this book, and I'm curious if you could share with everybody, because I thought it was so interesting, what effect this book, working on the book, has had on your own relationship to your own Catholicism, and whether you still are practicing Catholic, and whether was it a challenge to reintegrate your own spiritual life with what you learned while working on this book?
Yeah, so, a colleague of mine, when I wrote the first article about the 1838 sale, said, oh, well, surely you're going to write about being Black and Catholic. And I was like, no, I don't think so. It didn't, it hadn't, it hadn't come to me that way. It came to me because of my interest in this. But of course, doing this work, while being a practicing Catholic, and I am a practicing Catholic, the records are, again, children sold without their parents, a girl swapped for a horse, priests in the 1820s writing about dilapidated quarters for enslaved people that are described as, quote, universally unfit for human beings. Pregnant women being whipped. I mean, so, this is sobering stuff for sure. So a lot of people say, well, how do you stay? And so one thing I say sometimes too is kind of like, where would I go? It's America, folks. Where would I bank? Where would I mean, because in fact, of course, my book is about the Catholic Church, but this is the story of religious organizations around the country. Even the Quakers enslaved people before they didn't, right? So, and faith, there's a mystery about faith, right? And also, I would say that one of the interesting things about that I learned was that many of these enslaved people remained in the church that had betrayed them, even after the Civil War. It was one of the biggest surprises to me. And those records were really important, the sacramental records, that they were baptizing and marrying in the church. Some became lay leaders, some became even religious leaders. And they worked to reshape and make this church more reflective of the Black people who belonged. And it was notable because thousands left the Catholic Church because the church were segregated in terms of seating, in terms of who got communion first, in terms of festivities. But the determination of some of these families to prod and push the church to be true to its ideals of universality spoke to me.
Thank you, Rachel and Khalil. It was terrific. I had a trillion questions for you. I'm so glad you did this, and I'm going to keep it to one. And that is, it's been some time since you started writing about this tragic sale. I mean, all these sales are tragic, trafficking in children. But at any rate, in the last year or so, as Khalil knows, is a leader, books have been under siege and ideas have been under siege. How has this sort of DeSantis kind of led assault on American history affected the reception of your book and your thinking?
Yeah, you know, it is an interesting time because history is a battleground right now. And we actually have kind of two things happening at the same time. So I write about the Catholic Church in Georgetown, but of course it's not just the Catholic Church in Georgetown. Harvard University is wrestling with this. Municipalities are, looking at the state of California, Evanston, Illinois, wrestling with kind of the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow.
New Jersey.
And New Jersey, New Jersey, this northern state that had slavery the longest, right? And so, and you have, folks making efforts. So there are all these fledgling efforts out there trying to kind of address and figure out what to do at the same time as we have these headwinds of politicians trying to keep us from doing, teaching this stuff, writing about this stuff. I myself haven't felt anything so far, which I'm glad about, but it feels, when I started working on this in 2016, it felt urgent to me. I don't know that anyone else at the New York Times thought it was urgent then, but it felt urgent to me, and it feels even more urgent now, given where we are.
Can I ask a piggyback question?
Yes.
You can give a lightning response, but I mean, it seems to me that one of the things you're writing against, and that has been also raised in the question about your personal Catholicism, is like, do people imagine Catholic exceptionalism? Meaning, to the extent that the story of religion and whiteness is a national story. I mean, are you finding that in your interactions, this is to pick up on Nell's question, are you finding in your interactions that Catholics are more defensive, like this is not who we are, or that they express the same kind of denial and erasure that white Floridians do who support DeSantis? I'm just curious, like, is there something particular about how Catholics encounter this work that is different from other white people who are wrestling with how much Black history they want to learn or teach their kids?
I think obviously there are parallels, of course. I do encounter, resistance for sure, And I would say that one of the best questions that I've gotten from a journalist was it was just like an aside, a last kind of aside question, which was, what does your parish priest and your parish think about this? And I said, I haven't told them. And I think that, and he was astonished. I was kind of like, yeah. I said, that's an excellent question. And it speaks to, in fact, because I know that this is not always welcome, well received. I'd rather be just the lady in the pews, not necessarily. I think it's still complicated.
So Catholic.
Yeah.
I have two questions. You're talking about the Jesuit response. Have you heard anything about Rome Jesuit or actually the papal response to this question? Because it wasn't just Jesuits. I believe the Franciscans also used native slave labor to do their missions, like in California and in the Southwest.
You're absolutely right. So it's certainly not just the Jesuits,
Right.
not just the priests. The nuns enslaved people too. So many orders of nuns enslaved people. The descendants actually wrote to Rome and wrote to the Jesuits' leadership in Rome initially. And got a response back that was supportive of their efforts to press the provincials and to be in dialogue with them. I know that they have also reached out to Pope Francis, and I'm not sure what has happened with that, but there are efforts, and you're absolutely right, it is bigger than the Jesuits.
Rachel, thank you very much for writing this book. I graduated from Holy Cross, and what I would like to ask you is, from my experience, when I was there in the 80s, seeing the Lady Dorm and Ely Dorm were reminders to me, and I remember there was such denial, and I remember the old school Jesuits would tell me basically to shut up. It didn't exist, and I was saying, well, we were founded in 1843, do the math. And yet, so I wanted to ask, when you were doing your research, how much pushback were you getting as far as, were they forthcoming? I know there's a generational shift that has happened since I went to school there to what is now happening in the schools. They've taken down the name of the Lady Dorm now, and I know that we have a non-Jesuit president now. How much pushback did you get, and did you find there was a difference in the old school versus new school Catholic priests? And just describe what you went through.
Yeah, I think initially, especially when I was first doing this and thought, okay, what about these other Jesuit colleges? Where are there ties there? Are there not? And there was, for a number of them, after 1838, not us. And I know also, and a little more about that, but I know also that Georgetown had embarked on trying to address this history before my first story ran. They had established a working group with faculty, trying to look at the history, trying to think about how they should address the history. I know that, there were, as Georgetown, embarked and began taking steps, I know that there were some board members who raised concerns, like, where are we going with this? And alums who raised concern early on. I think I was about maybe a year or two into researching the book when I got an email, like a deep throat email from someone saying, they're hiding records from you. And, that there were more records and that, I needed to go. And so I don't know that Georgetown was hiding any records, but certainly there were. This person alerted me to the fact that some records that had not been cataloged had been found. These were important records. They were financial ledgers. As I mentioned, there was this idea that, the money that came in 1838 was it. And these ledgers documented, some of the money that continued to come in and continued to go to places like Holy Cross and Loyola University, Maryland. And in one of those books, as we mentioned, 1838 was the big sale, but there are lots of little sales. In one of the ledgers that documents kind of, the line by line of, money going in and out in sales, etc., there are some pages that are very neatly cut out of that ledger book. And I said, notice there are some pages very neatly cut out. And they said, yeah, we do know that. We don't know when that happened.
Well, lesson learned, folks. Want to know the history of slavery? Follow the money.
Follow the money.
Oh, hi. I'm Catholic too. I'm Puerto Rican. And this slavery thing with the Catholic Church, because you alluded to the British Catholics, I didn't know there were any coming to the New World, but they already had the Reformation. But in the 1500s, that's when slavery came to Puerto Rico and Cuba, way before 1619. But I do want to say, I continue to be Catholic. I don't set foot in the church. The Pope is nothing to me. I'm the Catholic that my mother and father raised me to be. Okay, so, because if Black Protestants don't leave their religions, why would we? And I have Native American friends, I have two, not a lot. And they even say, why are you practicing Christianity? Because of what, and that's all Christian faith, because of what was done to them. So it's not shocking that you and I are both Catholics, except you go to Mass, I don't. And the other thing, the Franciscans were inhuman. Do you know about Bartolomé de las Casas? He used to defend the Indians in Puerto Rico. He used to tell the Pope, these Franciscans are horrible, they're enslaving them.
Yes.
And the Franciscans, when they had their courts in Rome or in Vatican, they would vilify Francisco. He's a Dominican, so I like Dominicans a little bit more. Franciscans, I won't even sing that song. Make me an instrument of your peace. Kill my ass? I don't think so. So I could go on and on. But we started it first. But we were the only thing with the Hispanic Catholics. If you know about St. Peter Claver, they were less likely to bust up families. That's all. But still, they shouldn't have enslaved anybody.
Right, and actually it's a very good point because, in terms of Latin America, because the numbers of folks who were enslaved by Jesuits in Latin America far outnumbers the numbers here. It's important history and there's a lot more that could be done there.
Can we do one more question? Are you?
Okay.
Yeah, but his hand is up for a while.
Okay, thank you.
Gentleman right there.
You, sorry, I couldn't see you.
No problem. Thank you so much for coming. I imagine there are a few alums of Georgetown in this room like myself, and I can remember being a student on campus and there always being these vestiges about how the institution empowered itself on the backs of Black people. And from as recent as Georgetown being a Black neighborhood in DC, Black folks being pushed out to as far back as the sale. And one of those vestiges that always sticks out in my mind that I wonder if you ever came across was there was always a rumor, I don't know how true it was, that Patrick Healy was Black and that there were a set of leaders in the 19th century at Georgetown that were actually Black. And I'm wondering if there's any connection, if you came across, and how they might have reconciled that.
Yeah, I mean, he was. So and I'm not a historian of this, but generally, he was, he had an enslaved mother and a white father, and the priest knew who he was. He actually inherited, is my understanding, enslaved people too, and maybe there were some sales of those folks. But he was light-skinned and could pass. And I think Georgetown does say that he was like the first Black president of a major institution.
They say that now, not before.
Yeah,
And
you're probably, yeah. I mean, and certainly I think that they knew but did not at the time, they did not advertise that. And he himself, I think, had a very complicated relationship with his own race and history of enslavement.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you have one more? You up for it?
Hello. As a Catholic and a Jesuit also, and a supporter of Jesuit institutions, I'm actually encouraged by what Georgetown did, the attempt to kind of rationalize what happened. And it speaks to Catholics, our recognition that we are all fallible. Even Jesuit priests are fallible. But it's how we respond to these human foibles and how we deal with them. So I'm actually encouraged by the response of the Jesuits and the institution and how they've tried to reconcile as best they can this terrible thing that happened in their history.
I think, one thing, I think descendants are kind of, all divided about kind of how they see kind of how the institutions have responded. But I think that, Georgetown did not, Jack DeGioia did not shy away from this. People and students and descendants and others may debate, how far enough, what more can be done. Others might say too much, etc. But I think they have, decided that, and again, before my story ran, that they were going to wrestle with this. And the president of the university traveled and has, to Louisiana to meet descendants. And, I think that they're, certainly for me, someone, writing this in 2016, I never expected to see even the steps, I just never expected to see what has happened. And I think that I think that it's important, I think that it's urgent for institutions to do this kind of work. Even as, my role is not to say, great work, need to do more, but I think, it's important. The history is important and reckoning with it is really important.
Thank you so much, I really appreciate it. Thank you all for coming. As I mentioned, the books are for sale. Rachel will be signing. Thank you both so much. What a wonderful conversation.